And welcome back. As we go ahead and dive right into working with multi-dimensional arrays, I've gone ahead and set up a kind of a small scenario here for us to work through to use a multi-dimensional array to solve. So here we're going to create a multi-dimensional array of strings that's going to be formatted as follows: name, age, and grade. And what we want to do, of course, is use a multi-dimensional array to fill it. You could say, well, what if I use a single dimensional array? Well, the problem is we have three different distinct categories here. And while I could try to say, well, this is a type of string, and this is a integer, and this is also an integer, for our purposes, we're just going to go ahead and leave them all as strings. And if we needed to manipulate it in some way, we of course could parse that string and convert it over into an integer. So let's go ahead and follow this prompt here. So we said, please enter the name, age, and grade of each student. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my multi-dimensional array to go ahead and solve this. Now, if you remember, a multi-dimensional array is going to go ahead and use a nested for loop. So let's first start by filling the array. So we'll start with an outer for loop, and you can use row column as your identifiers. That's a nice way for you to help remember it. Or you can use I and J, which is another common naming convention for your loops. I'm going to go ahead and use I and J this time because in my last example I did use row and column. So I'm just going to use int I equals 0. I is less than, but before I can do that, I need to first, of course, create the array. So let's go ahead and add a quick prompt that's going to ask how many students. So system.out.println, how many students do you need records for? And let's just go ahead and store that in an int. So int number of records equals kb.nextInt. And now we can, of course, use that to specify the size of the array. So let's go ahead and create, in this case, a string array. So we'll say string, and we're going to do a two-dimensional array. And let's just call this student records. And we'll set this equal to a new string multi-dimensional array. And we had to think a little bit about here, how big is this array actually going to be? Because you notice we have number of records, which is, of course, identifying one piece of this, but we also have only 3 here. This should help give us an idea of which one of these values we want to print in. Remember, this is always a row and columns. So if this is the number of columns, that means this will be 3, and that means the other one will be number of records. With that filled in, we can now go ahead and use this to go ahead and start filling in the rest of my data. So let's just use I is less than the number of records, I++. Go ahead and create our first for loop, and then we'll go ahead and do the second one. Int j is equal to 0. And we'll say j is less than 3, because remember we do have only 3 columns here. And we'll do j++. All right, and that's of course just the start of our array. So now we can fill it. So we'll just say system.out.println, enter the student's name, and then we can just say string name is equal to, actually we can store this directly into that array. So let's actually just go ahead and call, since we have our array called student records, we can do student records. And we want that to be I, because that's the position of the outside loop. And we want j, because that's the position of the inside loop, is equal to kb.nextLine. And of course, I have a small typo here, so let me just fix that real quick. There we go. So student records of ij is equal to kb.nextLine. This is a quick way to do it. If you're, of course, struggling with this, you of course could create some temporary variables. So I could create, for example, string name is equal to kb.nextLine, then string age, etc., etc. Of course, we can then do that. Now, here is the kicker. If I do it this way, remember the first thing is the name, but then I also need to get the age, and then I need to get the grade. So this is a little bit of a tricky one here, because in this case, if I simply just pull this information in as is, it's going to store this potentially not in the right locations. So this is one of those times when we start working with multidimensional arrays that we might have to think about how we want to put that in. Because if this was simply just, for example, a column of names, then what would happen is that this is going to then fill that in and we would be fine. But because we want the first one to be the name and the next one to be the age and the next one to be the grade and so on and so forth, that means we're going to have to get a little creative with this inner loop. So what I'm going to actually do here is I'm going to copy that. Let's go ahead and paste that in. Because we know this array is so large, we can go ahead and say j plus 1. We can do j plus 2. And we'll change this to age and grade. Now the only caveat is that if we do this as is, do we really still need this loop? Well, technically, no. We could probably just go ahead and go through this, but then we have no way of specifying what that initial position is. We could just say 0, and then just make this 1 and 2. But this way is just another approach. And then, of course, because we know that we have that filled, we could simply just break out. But again, if you don't want to use a nested loop for this example, it is simply just another way to do it. But the reason why I'm using a nested for loop is because very often when you're using a multidimensional array, the nested for loop is the best approach. All right, so that will allow us to break out that array. And then let's go ahead and print this array. So we'll print array. And again, I'm going to do a nested for loop. In fact, I'm actually just going to copy my headers to make this a little bit easier for myself. And so now all we want to do is do a system.out.print of, first thing we're going to want to do, of course, is just print out whatever's in that first column. Because remember, we have name, age, and grade. So I want to print, in this case, student records of I, J, and I'm actually going to concatenate in here a tab followed by a vertical pipe, and then have that concatenate in another tab. So I'm going to just do another /t. And what that will allow me to do is make sure that this is always spaced out appropriately. And of course, anytime we have a new record line, we're going to just go ahead and do a system.out.println. And let's just go ahead and test this out and see what we get. And so we're going to keep this simple. Let's just say we're going to put in 2 students. All right, so let's go ahead and put this in. And notice I'm getting enter the student's name, enter the student's grade. So things are, of course, jumping a little crazy here. So we may have to modify things. So let's just have a student, we'll call it Billy. And Billy is in grade 10. And notice now we're back to here. So we are skipping a line here. So we may have to revisit this. Let's call the next one Bob and make him 12. And he is in grade, let's say, 7. All right. Now notice we did get some, like I said, that first one was a little weird, but we do see how our formatting is working correctly here. And the reason why we might be having that is because we have this kb.next in here. So we're just going to go ahead and come up here and add in after our kb.next, because remember, this doesn't return the character, so I'm just going to do a blank kb.next line. And what that'll do is force that cursor down to the next line, so we're not getting that automatic kind of no input there. So let's go ahead and rerun it. All right, so again, we'll do 2 records. So let's do Billy. We'll say Billy is, let's say, 15 this time. We'll say their grade is grade 10. We'll enter another student. This will make this one Bob. We'll say Bob is 12 and they are in the 8th grade. All right, and you can see now we have this formatted. We do, of course, have this other escape here with the tab. I'm not worried about that because that's just a minor thing to clean up. But it allowed us to format that in such a nice way. And again, there's a different way we could have filled this particular array because, you know, we didn't have to do this particular thing. If I had a different approach, I could, of course, just had done this with simply just saying like I and then 0, I1, I2, and then I wouldn't have needed this loop. But because, again, multidimensional arrays, a lot of times you're dealing with this nested loop, I wanted to go ahead and show that example. But just for kicks, let me just go ahead and add that real quick here for you so you can go ahead and see that. So if I change this to 0, I'll make this I of 1 and then I2. And I'm actually going to remove this inner loop completely. And let me just take that out temporarily. So we could do this way with a single loop. So if I go ahead and rerun it, let's go ahead and just do 2. Billy, 15, he's in grade 10. Bob was, we said, 12, and he's in grade 8. You can see we get the exact same output. But again, both ways work, but I wanted to make sure that you had experience with a nested for loop, because again, nested for loops are very important to have a good foundational understanding on. But as you can see, you don't always necessarily need them, even for a multidimensional array, and it's really going to depend on what kind of problem you are trying to solve.